Breaking news. In the space of a few hours, the illusion cracked. An event, promoted as sold out, was still quietly pushing tickets behind the curtain. Not discounted tickets, not symbolic entry. Premium access priced at $3,199 Australian dollars for VIP and $2,699 for standard. Then came the line that changed everything. Please do not share this information publicly. That was the moment the language of wellness stopped sounding like wellness at all. That was the moment the language of empowerment began to read like a transaction. Think about that. A supposedly exclusive retreat, already framed as full, already wrapped in the glow of scarcity, was still reaching out for more buyers, not publicly, privately, urgently, quietly. And that changes the story at once. Because once an event claims it is sold out, the public is no longer being asked to buy a place. They are being asked to believe in demand. They are being asked to believe in status. They are being asked to believe that the room is already full, that access is rare, that proximity is precious. But if more invitations are still going out in the dark, then the scarcity was never the story. The story was the sale. This is where the mask slips. For years, Meghan had been presented as a figure of influence, aspiration, and emotional authority. The image was polished, the message was controlled, the packaging was elegant. But this email did not sound elegant. It sounded desperate. It did not sound selective. It sounded mass-produced. It did not sound like a community. It sounded like inventory still needing to move. How did we get here? If the retreat was genuinely full, why were fresh offers still being circulated within hours? If the experience was truly exclusive, why did the invitation feel like a standard sales prompt? And if there was nothing improper in the process, why include the warning at all? Why tell recipients not to make the information public? Let that sink in. Because that single sentence does more than raise suspicion. It establishes intent. It tells the audience that the people behind this offer understood exactly how damaging transparency could be. They knew the contradiction. They knew what the public had been told. And they knew that if the private message escaped, the official narrative would begin to collapse. This is no minor embarrassment. This is the point of no return. At that moment, Meghan no longer appears as a host curating a meaningful gathering. She appears as the face of a machine converting prestige into cash. The word community begins to look like camouflage. The language of uplift begins to look like cover. And the retreat itself begins to look less like a sanctuary than a high-priced extraction exercise dressed in the soft vocabulary of healing. That is what makes this so explosive. Not simply the price, not simply the secrecy, but the structure beneath it. The suggestion that the public image and the private operation were telling two different stories at the same time. One for the cameras, one for the inbox, and once that contradiction is seen, it cannot be unseen. Because this email did not merely expose one event, it exposed a pattern, a method, a dependence on image so intense that even the appearance of demand had to be manufactured, protected, and hidden from scrutiny. But the deeper shock was still to come, because behind the polished branding, behind the inflated exclusivity, behind the urgent need to keep quiet, there was something far more dangerous than reputational damage. Money was running out. This was no longer a reputational wobble. It was a cash crisis. The glamour had stopped paying the bills. Behind the speeches, behind the curated appearances, behind the carefully rationed public visibility, the numbers were beginning to speak with brutal clarity. The money was moving out faster than it was coming in. The great streaming deals that once gave the operation its aura of inevitability were no longer there. Netflix was no longer a shield. Spotify was no longer a lifeline. The age of headline contracts had ended. What remained was far smaller, far less stable, and far more dangerous. And that is where the panic begins. Because a brand can survive mockery for a while. A celebrity can survive backlash for a while. But when the revenue weakens at the exact moment the costs remain enormous, the crisis stops being public relations and becomes survival. Reports pointed to a need for roughly £3 million a year after tax, simply to sustain the life they had built. Not to expand it, not to relaunch it, simply to keep it standing. Think about that. £3 million a year, and the old machinery was no longer producing at the level it once promised. The premium contracts had run their course. The credibility of fresh commercial ventures was under question. The returns being spoken about in public were increasingly difficult to verify, and around the edges of the empire, the signs of weakness were already visible. Slow performance, weak traction, product claims that sounded stronger than the evidence behind them. Media output that no longer carried the force it was supposed to command. That is how decline really happens. Not with one explosion, but with the steady failure of promised value. A business model built on attention can only survive if attention converts into revenue. A public identity built on prestige can only survive if prestige still carries commercial weight. But once the market begins to hesitate, everything becomes more severe. Every launch matters more. Every appearance carries more pressure. Every invitation, every interview, every staged glimpse of access stops being an act of connection and becomes an extraction attempt. That is the core of the collapse. Because when money tightens, judgment changes, risk changes, motive changes. Public appearances are no longer just appearances. They become financial instruments. Visibility becomes liquidity. Sympathy becomes capital. Relevance becomes collateral. Let that sink in. What is left of a brand when turnover can no longer protect reputation? What is left of strategy when every move begins to look like a response to shortage? And when money becomes the central fear, who still controls the boundary between truth and performance? That is the question hanging over every decision in this phase of the story. Because scarcity does not merely expose weakness. It distorts behavior. It drives escalation. It makes people sell harder, conceal more, and present urgency as purpose. In that kind of environment, image is no longer an accessory. It is the asset being spent down to the last possible pound. And that is why this phase matters so much. The issue was no longer whether the public admired them. The issue was whether the operation underneath the image was still financially viable. Whether the prestige that once opened doors could still generate enough cash to sustain the security, the staffing, the overhead, the expectations, the scale of the life itself. Once that question enters the record, everything changes, because now each public act must be read differently, not as expression, not as outreach, not as symbolism, but as necessity. This is no longer strategy in its strongest form. It is strategy under pressure. And strategy under pressure is where masks fail, instincts surface, and dangerous decisions begin. But even this was not the gravest threat, because financial desperation becomes truly explosive at the moment it turns its eyes towards inherited power. And the most dangerous move of all was still ahead. And this is where the crisis stopped looking financial and started looking intimate. Because once the money begins to thin, the performance becomes harder to contain. The strain starts showing through the seams, the smiles remain, the camera still rolls, the gestures still arrive on cue, but the underlying impression is no longer one of warmth. It is one of management. Control, maintenance, preservation of an image under pressure. That is the true significance of the marriage in this phase of the story. Not romance, not partnership, function. The suggestion now is not merely that the relationship is troubled. The suggestion is that it has become instrumental, that it must keep appearing intact because too much depends on the appearance. The public must still see unity. The brand must still project emotional legitimacy. The story must still hold. And so the marriage itself begins to look less like a private bond and more like a structure under constant external use. That is what gives this section its chill. Outside, there are still soft images, a domestic video, a supportive remark, a carefully timed glimpse of affection, then the sentimental language of motherhood, then the carefully framed appearances around children, vulnerability, compassion. But in the logic of this account, none of these moments land as spontaneous. They land as exhibits. Each one seems selected. Each one seems purposed. Each one seems designed to transmit a message more than reveal a truth. Let that sink in. Because when every tender symbol becomes usable material, tenderness itself begins to lose credibility. Flowers no longer signify warmth, they signify presentation. A book about maternal feeling no longer signifies sincerity, it signifies positioning. Even a hospital visit no longer arrives as human contact. It arrives under suspicion, as though compassion itself has been processed into public currency. And at the centre of that mechanism stands Harry, not as a leading force, not as a sovereign man directing events, but as a figure increasingly read as necessary to the display. A husband, yes, but also a witness, a confirmer, a human signature attached to the projected image. He appears less like an equal architect than a man absorbed into a system that now requires his presence in order to keep its claims alive. Half accomplice, half captive. That is the dark brilliance of it. Because if he resists, the image fractures. If he complies, he reinforces it. How did we get here? When every private moment is carried onto a stage, what remains private at all? When a marriage must continually prove its own health, is that not the earliest sign that something essential has already gone wrong? And if Harry now exists mainly to validate the scene beside him, is he still a partner in the full sense of the word, or has he become part of the set? Those questions matter because this is no longer a story about affection. It is a story about conversion, the conversion of intimacy into optics, the conversion of family into message, the conversion of emotional symbols into strategic assets at the precise moment the wider structure is under threat. That is why this middle act matters so much. It shows what pressure does from the inside. Financial weakness may explain the urgency, but psychological collapse explains the tone, the relentless need to curate, the inability to let a moment remain, simply a moment, the compulsion to turn every appearance into reinforcement, every symbol into evidence, every gesture into a shield against what is closing in. And yet even that was not enough to complete the tragedy, because a strained marriage and a declining brand do not become historic until they collide with power. And the fatal turn in this story was not that the mask slipped, it was that with the mask slipping, they began looking back towards the institution they had once abandoned. And that was the moment the danger widened. Because a failing public project is one thing. A return bid aimed at the centre of the monarchy is another entirely. Once Meghan and Harry are understood, not as estranged figures fading at the edge, but as figures seeking re-entry through a global stage, the matter ceases to be personal. It becomes constitutional in tone, dynastic in consequence, and ruthless in implication. This is the point of no return. A couple losing money can still retreat. A couple losing prestige can still disappear. But a couple losing money, losing prestige, and losing control of the narrative may decide on something far more consequential. They may seek to borrow legitimacy from the very institution they once wounded. Think about that. King Charles stands at the centre of the trap. As father, he is bound by blood. As sovereign, he is bound by duty. Those obligations do not move together, they collide. William and Catherine stand on the other side of that collision, not as loud participants, but as embodiments of continuity, order, and the future itself. They do not need to speak. Their position speaks for them. So the question becomes unavoidable. Can a king rescue his son without weakening the crown? Is this return truly reconciliation, or merely re-entry under a softer name? And if those who profited from attacking the institution now seek its shelter again, what exactly is being asked of the monarchy? Because this would not be a family reunion. It would be a transfer of cost, and the palace would be expected to pay. And so the private collapse became a public threat. What began as a dubious sale then widened into financial strain, then darkened into a marriage under pressure, now hangs over the monarchy itself like a spectre at the worst possible hour. That is the final escalation. Meghan and Harry are no longer merely two damaged public figures fighting decline. In this telling, they become a destabilizing force, approaching an institution already carrying illness, duty, succession, and history on its shoulders. King Charles bears the burden of the crown while the clock presses in. William and Catherine stand as the visible line of continuity, the guarantee that the structure will outlive the storm. And yet, at the exact moment the monarchy needs silence, discipline, and steadiness, the possibility of return appears on the horizon, carrying noise, grievance, financial desperation, and unfinished warfare over image. That is the real conflict. The individual demands visibility. The institution demands survival. One side seeks restoration. The other cannot afford contamination. Think about that. If they return, who controls the story? If the king opens the door, is that mercy or a historical misjudgment? And if he refuses, is that cruelty or the first honest act of defense? Because sometimes the greatest danger to a throne is not the enemy beyond the gates. It is the wounded claimant who already knows the way back in. And now the final question stands in full view. Will the House of Windsor protect the family or protect the crown?